Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are on a critical mission. We're giving you the high-velocity TLDR of a massive source.
Yeah, this one is a beast. We're talking about Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 108. It was a 3-hour and 5-minute live stream.
Delivered by Simon Dixon. I mean, for those who don't know, he's a Bitcoin OG, a serious investor, and a geopolitical and financial analyst. The stream was on November 28th, 2025.
And look, 3 hours is a huge time commitment, even for the most dedicated follower. So our job here is to basically synthesize all of that.
We're going to give you all the essential knowledge nuggets, the context, the connections, everything you need, but in a fraction of the time.
Exactly. We want you to be fully informed on the some of the really explosive claims and the analysis that was presented.
Absolutely. We're here to cut through the noise and deliver the signal, and the core conflict that the analysis establishes is pretty stark.
It is. He frames it as a massive, coordinated, full-blown attack launched by what he calls the Proof of Weapons Network.
The PWN.
The PWN, right. And it's an attack against peaceful proof of work, which is, Bitcoin.
So we should probably define what he means by the PWN. Because it's not just a government or a bank, is it?
No, not at all. It's a systemic force. The source defines it as the sophisticated system that weaponizes, well, everything: technology, media, military force.
And most importantly, the financial weapons of mass destruction, the WMDs.
That's the key. All of it is used to achieve total systemic control over global finance, over markets, and even political structures.
So it's basically a picture of centralized powers fighting back hard against decentralization. And this deep dive structures that whole offensive into three really compelling and interlocking pillars.
Yeah, it's a great structure. We start with the historical threat, that's this week in Bitcoin, and it really unmasks this Epstein funding pipeline and some of the earliest attack vectors on the protocol itself.
Then we shift to the present-day threat, this week in macro. And this is where we dissect the financial vassalization strategy. It specifically targets MicroStrategy, MSTR.
And the coordinated actions involving big names like JP Morgan and, of course, Tether.
And finally, we connect all of that financial warfare right to the highest levels of power in This Week in Geopolitics, where we get into the role of geopolitical leverage.
And the alleged strategic weaponization of the Trump and Epstein files, all of it used to enforce compliance.
So we're connecting historical contamination, present financial pressure, and future political control.
It's a huge narrative, so let's just unpack it. We should probably start at the very foundation, looking at Bitcoin's own structural defenses and the historical weaknesses the PWN is always trying to exploit.
Okay, let's jump right into Deep Dive 1, Unmasking the Epstein Bitcoin Theory and this historical threat. Before we get into the attacks, let's just quickly remind everyone what makes Bitcoin so structurally resilient in the first place.
Well, it's open source nature, right? The code is public, anyone can audit it.
Yeah.
And it's secured by the largest distributed supercomputer ever assembled.
Powered by miners and hash power all over the globe.
And consensus is enforced by millions of individual node runners. But the crucial point is that the code itself have no backdoors.
That is the key distinction. The code is hardened. But the analysis really hammers home that the centralization risk lies in the choke points, the human elements.
Precisely. While the protocol is sound, these centralized choke points, the developers who implement the updates, the big mining pools, the venture capitalists, the centralized exchanges, they are always under attack.
And they're subject to what the source calls vassalization.
Which is basically forced submission, using financial leverage to make them bow to the system's demands.
So the core question the analysis poses is, what was the original threat? Was Bitcoin designed from the get-go as a honeypot?
You mean something with a secret backdoor designed for total seizure once adoption hit a critical mass?
Right. Or was it a gateway drug? A necessary step to get the public used to the idea of digital money before shifting them onto controlled, centralized CBDCs or stablecoins.
And the analysis comes down hard on the gateway drug theory. It suggests that, Bitcoin was allowed to flourish to normalize this concept of digital scarcity and peer-to-peer electronic cash.
Making the eventual switch to fully controlled digital currencies less of a shock for the masses.
Exactly. So the attacks focus on controlling the narrative and the on-ramps, not necessarily trying to compromise the fundamental math.
Which makes the early history of developer funding so critical. And this is where we get to attack Vector 1, the Epstein MIT Bitcoin Core funding pipeline. So how did developer funding evolve, and what created this vulnerability?
In the early days, it was pretty simple, just donations, some direct corporate funding from places like BitPay. But the community realized they needed a centralized body for, legal representation and funding developers.
And that led to the creation of the Bitcoin Foundation.
The irony being that the attempt to centralize administration for protection created the absolute perfect attack surface.
And the collapse of the Bitcoin Foundation was, a textbook example of these early attack vectors. We saw so many controversies that just laid bare the risks of relying on these centralized fiduciaries.
Oh, yeah. Look at the names involved. You had Charlie Shrem, who ran BitInstant, who was later arrested for money laundering tied to Silk Road and Mt. Gox.
His operation was a critical, centralized choke point between fiat and crypto.
And it shows that relying on these corporate entities, no matter how idealistic they start, means they eventually have to comply with financial regulations and they face these huge fiduciary risks.
And of course, the most dramatic failure was Mt. Gox itself. This wasn't just losing funds, it was a demonstration of a crucial financial weapon.
That's the point. Customers thought they held Bitcoin, but what they really held were IOUs. It was fractional reserve Bitcoin.
Which is the core realization the analysis emphasizes. Fractional reserve Bitcoin inside a centralized entity is it's fiat 2.0.
The risk is trust, not math. And what's more, Gox was initially purchased from Jeb McCaleb, the guy who also created XRP and later sold it to Ripple Labs.
A company that is now tied directly into the banking network, acting as an intermediary for interbank settlements.
So the original Bitcoin failure point leads directly to a modern banking solution. It's an incredible link.
And the foundation wasn't just plagued by financial scandals. It was being sabotaged from within by ideological warfare.
Correct. John Matonis, the foundation chairman, he notoriously brought in Craig Wright
The infamous figure who falsely claims to be Satoshi.
to initiate the block war. This is a deliberate attempt to hard fork Bitcoin, which led to the creation of altcoins like Bitcoin Cash and BSV. It was a clear injection of division, turning a technical debate into a toxic conflict.
And then there's Brock Pierce. The source flags him as another controversial figure from the foundation, with allegations and settlements related to sexual crimes. But his relevance here is less about his personal history.
And more about his foundational role in the financial attack structure. Pierce was an early VC with blockchain capital, and, critically, he launched the project that later transformed into Tether.
And Tether is now the dominant stablecoin, a key component of that gateway drug strategy, getting users comfortable with dollar-pegged digital assets.
The analysis also highlights his early contact with Epstein, which suggests a connection between the earliest VC money, these compromised figures, and the rise of the whole stablecoin mechanism.
So the foundation dissolves in disgrace, funding dries up, and there's a vacuum. Then the institutional response arrives in 2015, the MIT pivot.
And this is where the Epstein connection moves from, the shadows into undeniable fact. The analysis details the revelation that the MIT Media Lab got substantial funding that was facilitated by Jeffrey Epstein.
This was a direct workaround of MIT's own internal reputational risk policies.
Yeah, Epstein even helped arrange a large donation from Leon Black, which proves his influence wasn't just philanthropic, it was strategic, he was a broker.
And the pivotal piece of evidence that connects Epstein's money directly to core development is the big win email. We really have to pause on this for a second.
Absolutely. Joy Ito, who was the Media Lab director, sent an email directly to Epstein. The title was Digital Currency Initiative, and the content is it's explosive.
What did it say?
Ito explicitly credited Epstein's gift funds for allowing them to move quickly and win this round by securing key Bitcoin core developers, he names them, Vladimir, Gavin, and Corey, right after the foundation collapsed.
The timing is just incredible. It suggests institutional forces capitalized immediately on the vacuum created by the foundation's failure.
Let's pause here because this gets misinterpreted a lot. The analysis establishes the funding pipeline. Epstein funded institution funds key Bitcoin core developers, but the link gets even more sinister when you track where that MIT Digital Currency Initiative went next.
Where did it go?
That same DCI later pivoted its focus. It moved into highly sensitive central banking research. They worked on two major CBDC pilots, Project Hamilton with the Boston Fed and Project Cedar with the New York Fed.
So you're saying there's a clear narrative line here, from a compromised funding source
to securing Bitcoin core talent.
And then using that institutional credibility to spearhead anti-Bitcoin centralized CBDC projects.
That's the argument. It's astonishing.
So what's the final conclusion on Bitcoin's code integrity? Did Epstein's money actually buy a backdoor into the code?
This is where we have to be really strict, like the analysis is. We have to separate fact from narrative.
Yeah.
Fact. The funding pipeline is proven. Epstein's money enabled the capture of developers by a major institution.
Not proven.
There is zero evidence suggesting this funding translated into direct technical influence on the code, or that it corrupted the block size debates, for example. The damage is what the source calls moral contamination.
And that moral contamination is the strategic weapon itself. It's used for narrative control. They don't need to break the code if they can just break the public's faith in where the code came from.
Exactly. Which brings us directly to attack vector 2, the coordinated Zcash push.
And this coordination is critical. The analysis points out that the Zcash PR campaign happened in the exact same week as the Epstein funding leaks were being strategically deployed.
The timing again. So why Zcash? We should probably look at its structure.
Okay, so Zcash relies on zero-knowledge proof technology. For those who aren't as familiar, how is that a structural vulnerability compared to Bitcoin's transparent proof of work?
Well, zero-knowledge proof is mathematically fascinating. It lets you prove, something without revealing the information itself. But Zcash implemented it through a highly centralized ceremony.
How so?
It relied on just 6 developers and the notorious destruction of Peter Todd's key to ensure the network was launched honestly, without any hidden inflation. It fundamentally relies on trust in those 6 individuals, not decentralized, verifiable math.
Trust. When Bitcoin's entire thesis is trustlessness.
Exactly. And on top of that, Zcash is controlled by a centralized company that collects a tax on every single mined Zcash block. It's an inherently centralized, trust-based, corporate taxed system. It is the antithesis of Bitcoin.
And who is pushing this alternative? The analysis points its finger directly at Barry Silbert.
Yeah, he owns key Zcash investment vehicles. And Silbert has a history of trying to compromise Bitcoin's integrity, most famously with the failed SegWit 2x attempt years ago, which aimed to centralize block production.
So now he's pushing Zcash heavily through financial products, TV appearances, ETF wrappers.
The whole playbook.
Yeah.
So the strategy is this perfect 1-2 punch. The Epstein funding narrative gets deployed to create FUD fear, uncertainty, and doubt around Bitcoin's moral integrity. It causes a fear cell among smaller holders.
And at the exact same time, a centralized, corporate-friendly alternative, Zcash, is aggressively promoted and packaged for institutional money.
It's classic narrative warfare married to market timing. The PWN uses moral contamination to drive down the price of the independent asset, letting their institutional friends scoop up cheap Bitcoin while positioning their preferred, centralized alternative as the trustworthy future.
Okay, that wraps up the historical and narrative contamination part. Now we have to transition to the present threat, which is where the financial pressure gets applied directly. This is Deep Dive 2, the macroeconomic strategy of financial vassalization.
And this section is so crucial because it gives us the how. It lays out the framework. The financial industrial complex, or FIC, operates using a 3-pronged system of financial WMDs to control stock prices and market flows.
And this is totally disconnected from genuine economic fundamentals.
Completely.
Okay, let's break down those 3 weapons the source identifies. What's the first weapon the FIC uses to reallocate wealth?
Money printing. It's the most basic, but it's also the most powerful mechanism. Through QE, subsidized debt, deficit spending, central banks just reallocate wealth.
Which creates that K-shaped economic recovery we always hear about.
Exactly. Asset owners who can borrow for cheap, they thrive. Wage earners fall behind. The system just ensures capital flows back to the FIC, regardless of actual productivity.
Okay, weapon number 2, index passive flows. This sounds a bit abstract, but it's a critical choke point, right?
It's the ultimate centralization mechanism in public markets. By controlling the inclusion or exclusion criteria for major indices like the S&P 500 or the NASDAQ Q100, the FIC dictates where trillions in passive capital has to go.
So if you get removed from an index, funds that track that index are forced to dump your stock no matter how healthy your company is.
It forces companies to comply with index rules. It's like a soft form of regulation.
And the third weapon, market capture, is about controlling psychology and trade execution.
This is the complex use of algorithms, high-frequency trading, and most importantly, control over the media narratives that influence how investors think and feel. The FIC controls the messaging, making sure capital flows into their preferred derivatives and wrappers, not the underlying decentralized assets.
And connecting back to the historical threats, all these weapons are used to enforce vassalization. We need a strong definition of that here in this macro context.
Vassalization is forced submission. It is the strategic deployment of these financial WMDs, especially debt, complex corporate structures, and depending on index inclusion, to force a company to abandon its mission and align with the PWN strategy.
It turns an independent entity into a compliant pawn.
Precisely.
And the analysis argues that the most visible example of this happening today is Attack Vector 3, the MicroStrategy structural attack, which is positioned as the FIC's corporate proxy.
That phrase he uses, corporate honeypot, is really aggressive, but the structure kind of backs up the claim. MSTR, under the guise of being the most bullish Bitcoin company,
Is centralizing around 650,000 Bitcoin. That's a massive 3% of the total supply.
and to a corporate wrapper. And that wrapper is inherently subservient to shareholders, to debt holders, and to the regulations of the NYSE. It makes it a point of centralization and potential seizure.
Let's get into the specific metrics that make MSTR so vulnerable to this attack. We're talking about a really shocking structural asymmetry between their cash and their liabilities.
If figures are damning, MSTR holds about $54 million in cash, but they face a massive $700 million in annual financial obligations.
Mostly from the debt they took on to buy the Bitcoin in the first place.
And that disparity is the vassalization mechanism.
Wait, hold on. If they have that massive debt load, they are forced into a dependency loop. What does that mean in practical terms for them?
It means MSTR cannot function independently. It's constantly forced to rely on the FIC for capital raises, issuing more convertible debt or more equity just to meet those obligations.
And every time they tap the debt markets, they just increase their dependency on the institutional investors and hedge funds who hold their paper.
They're being leveraged into submission.
So let's trace the alleged kill shot timeline. The source suggests this was not accidental market pressure, but a highly coordinated institutional campaign leading up to November 2025.
It began with a narrative setting back in May 2025. You had Jim Chanos, a famous short seller, announce his position.
Which was long Bitcoin, short MSTR.
Right. And this seemingly benign move publicly sowed the seeds of doubt. It suggested that while the asset Bitcoin was good, the corporate wrapper, MSTR, was toxic. It started preparing investors to look for an exit ramp.
Then came the devastating liquidity drain in July 2025. JP Morgan implemented a massive punitive margin hike on MSTR shares.
This was a clear financial WMD. JPM raised the required collateral for holding MSTR shares from 50% to an almost prohibitive 95%.
And what does that do?
It immediately makes the stock virtually untradeable for leveraged funds and institutional desks. It drains all the liquidity, suppresses the stock price, and leaves MSTR vulnerable for the next wave of pressure.
And that next wave was index fear. In October 2025, MSCI, an index provider whose former parent company is Morgan Stanley, they announced a consultation. What was the focus of that?
It was a direct targeted hit. They were considering removing companies with over 50% of their total assets in digital commodities. Given MSTR's balance sheet, this was a clear signal to all the institutional passive funds. MSTR is about to be delisted.
Creating mandatory selling pressure.
Exactly. So as the index fear peaks, the institutions prepare the escape routes. They don't want that capital to flee into self-custody. They want to capture it in their own controlled products.
And this is where JPM and Morgan Stanley were simultaneously preparing and launching structured products linked to BlackRock's IBIT ETF.
They were building the compliant, Wall Street-approved alternative, ready to absorb the capital they were actively forcing out of MSTR.
And the analysis pinpoints the definitive moment of coordination, the final blow on November 20th.
On that single critical day, JPM did two things at once. First, they launched their IBIT structured note, the exit ramp. Second, they resurrected a 42-day-old MSCI note, specifically highlighting the MSTR delisting risk the wrecking ball.
That is the textbook definition of engineered capital migration. They use the threat of index exclusion to weaponize fear, discredit the MSTR wrapper, and then capture the fleeing liquidity by launching their own bank-controlled structured notes.
It's financial manipulation at a systemic level, and this engineered pressure leaves MSTR with only vassalization points debt options that force submission.
So MSTR must either sell its Bitcoin, which violates its entire ethos,
Or continuously raise more capital, which just deepens its dependency on the FIC.
or the third option, which the company allegedly leaked, is to pivot the business model entirely and become a Bitcoin bank, offering yield or paper Bitcoin to attract capital.
And this is the critical final step towards structural compromise. The analysis uses the analogy of long-term capital management, LTCM, the huge hedge fund that failed in '98 and needed a government bailout.
By becoming a systemically important Bitcoin bank, MSTR becomes a financial weapon of mass destruction that centralizes a critical portion of the Bitcoin supply.
But makes the taxpayer potentially responsible if it fails. The strategy socializes the losses while privatizing the centralization gains.
Okay, moving on. The vassalization strategy is also being applied through the regulatory gateway. This brings us to Attack Vector 4, Tether, and the Genius Act.
And Tether is a massive player. They're the largest private Bitcoin miner and the 17th largest holder of U.S. government debt. It's a geopolitical pawn.
Its scale makes it a target. And the primary regulatory mechanism here is the Genius Act, which was designed by Bo Hines right after he left the White House, coming from that PayPal Mafia Peter Thiel network.
And this act is not about protecting consumers. It's a regulatory capture mechanism for the FIC.
So the outcomes of the Genius Act are complex, but fundamentally they are designed to create a sort of covert CBDC for licensed financial institutions. How does it do that?
It allows licensed banks like JP Morgan to use Fed reserves to back stablecoins and pay yield. And by paying yield, these stablecoins become attractive, essentially turning bank liabilities backed by Federal Reserves into highly profitable collateralized debt obligations.
It formalizes the bank's control over digital dollar movement while capturing the stablecoin market.
And it forces existing stablecoin issuers into compliance. Companies like Coinbase and Circle, who started in the early Bitcoin ecosystem, are now incentivized to apply for bank status.
They're forced to comply to maximize shareholder value. If they refuse, they lose market access and investor trust. It's a classic squeeze play.
Conform or be financially ostracized.
Meanwhile, the Act incorporates aggressive censorship tools. We saw this play out with the arrest of the developers behind Samurai Wallet.
The Act actively discourages using privacy tools like CoinJoins or unique hardware wallets in the U.S. because the PWN requires total visibility and control over capital flows. The message is crystal clear. You can have digital money, but the state must be able to track and trace every single transaction.
And to complete the vassalization of Tether, the S&P steps in. The same credit rating agency that was so deeply compromised during the 2008 global financial crisis.
The S&P, a known historical vector of compromise, downgraded Tether, and the reason they cited was their excess reserves in gold and Bitcoin.
That's incredible.
And they explicitly linked Tether to market manipulation through MSTR. This is not a rating based on solvency. It's a political move to force Tether into compliance, demanding they ditch the decentralized assets and stick to regulated government-backed instruments.
And the greatest fear, I think, is that this systemic pressure is building a mechanism similar to the collapse of Terra Luna, but on a much grander scale.
Correct. The analysis suggests the goal is a cascading liquidation cycle. The S&P downgrade creates reputational risk and fear. If a severe market event or regulatory action triggers a run on Tether,
Tether would be forced to liquidate the Bitcoin that's backing its reserves.
this massive forced selling would crash the Bitcoin price, allowing the financial industrial complex to swoop in, acquire vast amounts of Bitcoin on the cheap, and solidify their centralized control.
So whether it's through corporate debt with MSTR or regulatory pressure on Tether, the core strategy is to force Bitcoin into corporate wrappers and regulatory frameworks that allow the FIC to leverage and seize the asset under duress.
It connects the historical contamination, that moral taint, to the present financial leverage, and it sets the stage for the final act of control, geopolitical enforcement.
Which moves us into our final section, Deep Dive 3, Geopolitical Leverage and the Trump Game, the Future Threat. This part connects global power struggles directly to the blackmail networks we've been discussing.
The analysis starts by defining the grand geopolitical conflict. It's between three major power factions that are often at odds: the MIC, the military-industrial complex, versus the FIC, the financial-industrial complex, and the TTEC, the technical-industrial complex.
Let's clarify the two opposing agendas here. What is the MIC's agenda, which, according to the source, relies on chaos?
The MIC's main goal is to maintain dollar hegemony through conflict. They rely on the forever war model, enforcing instability through proxy forces, and, as the analysis puts it, the weaponization of Zionism.
So this perpetual conflict justifies military spending, maintains demand for dollar-denominated oil, and ensures resource control in key regions.
Exactly. Conversely, the fictic agenda pushes for stability.
And why is stability in conflict zones necessary for the financial powers?
Stability is essential for de-dollarization and the shift to a multipolar world where trade is done in local currencies. The FICTIC pushes for regional stabilization, like Saudi-Iran and Saudi-Israel normalization, because stability enables their distressed acquisition strategy.
They want to invest and capture assets in peaceful, predictable markets, not volatile war zones.
Right. And this conflict really comes to a head in the Middle East, specifically with Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia's condition for normalizing relations with Israel is the resolution of the Palestinian cause.
An end to ethnic cleansing and the establishment of a viable Palestinian state. And this demand directly undercuts the MIC's strategy, which requires that perpetual instability to maintain dollar dominance and military justification.
Okay, so if that's the geopolitical landscape, we need to understand the role of key political figures, which leads us to Donald Trump, who the source labels a predictable asset. How does the PWN ensure control over political leaders?
Well, they use a three-pronged system of control. First, you groom the asset. Second, you control them through finance and lobbying. And third, the ultimate hammer, blackmail and leverage. And Trump's history demonstrates deep vulnerability across all three of those categories.
Let's look specifically at his background. The analysis roots his rise in the New York and New Jersey real estate world.
Which is described by the source as a cesspool of organized crime and endemic corruption. So Trump's ascent was symbiotic with and required cooperation from this underworld.
And the analysis highlights his mob and fixer ties. Can you give us specifics on those?
He notoriously used S&A Concrete for the construction of Trump Tower, a firm controlled by Genevieve's underboss Fat Tony Salerno. By using mob-controlled non-union labor, he got a massive cost advantage.
And his mentor in navigating that whole New York power game was the infamous mob lawyer, Roy Cohn.
His apprenticeship, as the source calls it, into the art of political and legal maneuvering, often outside the confines of the law.
So this establishes financial and legal leverage points. But the analysis points to the Zionist ball and chain, the marriage of Ivanka to Jared Kushner, as uniting two massive, already compromised power structures.
This is a critical point. Jared Kushner's father, Charles Kushner, has a documented history of severe compromise. He was convicted for tax fraud, witness tampering, and, most damningly, that infamous honey trap incident.
We need to detail the significance of that incident because the source claims it's the literal blueprint for the network's tactics.
Charles Kushner hired a prostitute to entrap and blackmail his own brother-in-law, who was cooperating with federal prosecutors investigating him. He videotaped the encounter and sent it to his sister as a threat.
And the analysis stresses this point. If the patriarch of the family has already perfected the art of using sexual leverage and entrapment to silence witnesses, the political asset within that family structure is inherently compromised and predictable to the PWN. That makes the subsequent discussion of the strategic weaponization of the Epstein files chillingly relevant. The analysis explicitly states that the recent leaks were not about justice.
Not at all. They were deemed a strategic, managed, highly partisan political tool used by MIC-aligned factions, the source specifically alleges Netanyahu and Israel, to enforce discipline on fixed assets like Trump during this critical global transition period.
Especially concerning the stability talks with Saudi Arabia.
Right.
That's a massive assertion, though. Connecting the Epstein files directly to specific geopolitical actors. Does the source provide concrete evidence linking the timing of the leaks to the strategic demands of Netanyahu's government?
The analysis argues the evidence is in the timing and the selection of what was leaked. It points to the immediate partisan theater. When Democrats released 3 cherry-picked emails to implicate Trump, it created maximum media hysteria.
And the GOP's immediate counter was a 20,000-file data dump,
which exposed the unredacted context, including a statement from Virginia Giuffre claiming Trump committed no wrongdoing. It effectively deflated the initial targeted narrative. The rapid response and control over the data flow indicate a managed release, not genuine transparency.
And the visible panic within the administration confirms the leverage. Trump personally calling a congresswoman to block the release bill, followed by that unprecedented Situation Room briefing by the Attorney General and FBI Director.
They used national security rhetoric to justify keeping it secret. This signaled that the files contained compromising information not just on politicians, but on intelligence assets and global financiers, confirming the depth of the PWN's network.
And this panic led to the ultimate political maneuver, the DOJ flip-flop. The administration suddenly reversed its policy and launched a highly targeted investigation.
Yes, but you have to note the targets. The investigation focused only on Democrats and figures tied to the FIC, specifically naming Bill Clinton and J.P. Morgan. It neatly avoided Republican figures.
And the mechanism of control is ingenious, leveraging the legal system itself. How does classifying documents as part of an ongoing investigation protect the entire network?
It legally invokes privilege. By turning the documents into evidence in an active federal investigation, the administration created a blanket shield. And this shield protects everyone, Republicans, global financiers, intelligence operatives, from the full, unredacted truth reaching the public.
So it ensures the PWN retains total command over the narrative and the material. The material is leveraged only when it's required for political discipline.
Exactly. And the files that were released, even the heavily redacted ones, confirm specific leverage points the PWN holds. Let's look at the three most revealing ones. First, Ghislaine Maxwell.
Maxwell's extreme preferential treatment in prison low security, even receiving a puppy.
It's cited as a clear indicator. She holds massive leverage over the PWN. She's not being punished, she's being protected and maintained because she is a critical nexus of information linking the highest levels of global finance, politics, and intelligence.
Second, Michael Wolff, the journalist. The analysis suggests he acted as an intelligence agent for Epstein.
Wolff offered to generate political debt from Donald Trump, saying Epstein could either hang him or save him. This shows Epstein's role as a trusted intermediary, capable of managing media narratives to apply or relieve pressure. It's the language of control, not journalism.
And third, Steve Bannon, a key political strategist, was documented asking Epstein to intervene with Wolff.
This final point shows Epstein's power extended into the inner circle of political strategists, proving he wasn't just a social connector, but an essential cog in managing media narratives and political ops for high-level figures across the entire political spectrum.
Wow, so every segment of this deep dive confirms that the historical moral contamination, the present-day financial vassalization, and the future geopolitical leverage are all linked through these centralized choke points that the proof of weapons network ruthlessly exploits. It's a unified strategy.
It is a profound analysis. It shows that the battle for Bitcoin is not just about price or code. It's a fight for structural independence against a highly sophisticated network that relies on leverage, debt, and centralization.
So, after all that, what does this entire 3-hour deep dive mean for you, the listener, who is trying to secure their financial future in Bitcoin?
It means you have to recognize the connection of these three themes. The historical taint created the narrative weapon, which is now being used to justify the present-day vassalization strategy targeting MSTR and Tether with financial WMDs.
All while the ultimate geopolitical weapon, the Epstein files, is used to enforce compliance among global leaders.
The analysis states it clearly. The ultimate battle is between the derivative and fiat printers versus Bitcoin and self-custody. The only way for you to win this infinite game of independence is to exit the finite game of financial wrappers and centralized trust.
So this means boycotting the Wall Street wrappers and choke points, the MSTR shares, the ETFs, any Bitcoin-backed loan products that rely on fractional reserve risk and margin calls.
Because those products centralize your asset and subject it directly to the financial WMDs of the PWN. Structural independence through self-custody is the only robust defense.
And we have to end with the final provocative thought that really defines the scale of the challenge we face, especially given the sudden and complete reversal of federal DOJ policy to launch a targeted investigation and thus classify the full unredacted Epstein files.
We must seriously ask, what level of absolute total leverage must be held by the intelligence community and the proof of weapons network itself that they possess the power to force a complete and total reversal of federal DOJ policy, overriding constitutional transparency demands simply to prevent the full unredacted truth from ever reaching you?
That question, and the answer it implies, defines the depth of the challenge we face in preserving decentralized financial freedom today.